Let's go ahead and start with a question from Twitter. Thanks.
Okay, I guess I can read it. So it says, what do you see as one of the biggest issues with churches today, and how a lot of them seem to be afraid to tackle the big social issues of the day?
Well, can you hear me now? Hello? Hello? I'll just speak up for the time being. Hello, there we are. I like that. I like the sound of that voice. Just kidding. I think this is a really good question. It comes at quite a tender moment, I think, in our culture as well. One of the problems, the major problems with the church that I see today, and something that really troubles me, and I know that the three of us have talked about this before too, and it troubles us, is first of all, the infighting we see in so many churches. There seems to be a lot of division in the church itself over issues that I think are quite petty, and sometimes over issues that really shouldn't be the dominant issues. Because when we're fighting with one another, it tends to take our focus off of what we need to be focusing on, which namely is Christ and His will. It's funny, when you set your eyes on Christ and making yourself His disciple and His apprentice, and you devote yourself to that, to trying to follow Him so that He permeates every dimension of your personality, then many of the petty differences tend to fall away. When we become united on that commitment, it tends to bring things into perspective. But when we lose that focus, we tend to major on the minors. And when we major on the minors, some of the major social issues outside the church, some of the issues that should be demanding our attention, demanding a response, are not being paid attention to. And we're losing focus. And I think when I first moved to the States, I came from Europe in 1998. It was quite an interesting experience for me because I came to the South. I live in Atlanta, Georgia now. And one of the surprising features of the church culture in Atlanta, at least, that I came into contact with was that there, everybody was a Christian. No matter what you said, no matter what you did, no matter how you lived your life, it didn't matter. Everybody was a Christian. It was really my first contact with nominal Christianity. I'd come from Vienna, Austria, a place where people aren't so much atheist or agnostic as totally apathetic on the question of religion. They just didn't care whether there was a God or not. They wanted to live their lives. So in other words, in that kind of a context, either you are truly committed to what you believe, you are truly a Christian, or you're not. There's no middle ground. I think what we're seeing more and more now is vanishing middle ground in North America. And I think in many ways this is a good thing. But it's also going to show who truly believes what they say they believe. Because in a context of vanishing middle ground where social issues are really ramping up and Christians are being put on the spot and they're being asked questions that have serious, even legal repercussions, it's going to be interesting to see who actually sticks by what they say they believe. Whether it's just a matter of words, or whether it's really just a cultural commitment, or a nominal commitment. So I think there's a sea change sort of taking over the North American landscape, and I think we see the church really caught up in that struggle. But I also think there's a lot of reason for encouragement. I think we're seeing greater numbers of people who are becoming very genuine about their faith and who are becoming more and more bold and who are really coming to terms with the fact of what it means to be a Christian, to follow Christ, to apprentice oneself to Him and make Him your supreme Lord and Master. Lordship. That's a very odd issue in America. We don't tend to think of a king or we don't think in terms of paying our dues to a king or a ruler, but is Christ your Lord? It's something that I think we have to come to grips with. It's something that we have to wrestle with a little bit in this context.
Hi.
Hi.
So I understand that God's grace is unending, but does God ever get disappointed when we make the same or commit the same sin over and over again? And like, I'm trying not to make the same mistake, but then it just happens, and it seems like I'm trying to fight or like overcome sin on my own. But like, how do you rely on God's strength? Like, is there a specific way, or yeah?
Yeah. Thank you for your honesty. I have to say that in the microphone to everybody. So I don't know if any of you how much TV you watch, hopefully not too much. But I used to be a huge fan of House, the TV show House. This world of infectious diseases just like fascinated me. I was just all into bacteria and viruses and all these kind of things. So there was this one episode on House where LL Cool J was actually on House. He was on death row in prison, and he got sick with something. And he had to be treated in the hospital. And now the other doctors did not want to treat him because they were like, he's on death row. So they were not being very nice to him. So he's getting this one procedure done called the lumbar puncture. I don't have to go into what that is. But he was getting this one procedure done where you had to be really careful, otherwise it would hurt. And Omar Epps was the doctor who was working on him. And he was being really mean and nasty to him. And so finally LL Cool J rolls over and says to him, do you know what it's like to have your whole life be about the worst thing you ever did? And that struck me. And I think what's so amazing about the grace of God is that our life isn't all about our sins and our failures. He sees your struggle, and he sees that you are trying to please him. And he will help you through that. And I think there's certain things that we go through in life that we can just change like this. And sometimes it takes us a little bit longer because it may be an action or a thought or whatever that's deeper rooted. And so I think what happens is the danger in all of this is that while God is working with you and helping you to grow, is that you also can do the opposite, and you can start bringing like condemnation on yourself. And I'm horrible, and what's wrong with me, and I can't get it together, and God hates me, and all these kind of things. When really it's the opposite. His grace is enough for you, and he's patient with you, and he's kind, and he will continue to work in you to change you. And the fact that your heart, the fact that you're even in line asking this question is a demonstration of where your heart is, that, Lord, I want to please you, and I'm struggling with this, and can you help me? So what I would encourage you to do is to just continue to just ask for his help, but don't torment yourself in your mind and put yourself down because you keep failing. Just keep working at it and keep growing, and he will continue to give you strength. You can't do it on your own, you're right, and that's part of the frustration. He's got to do it with you. Your life is not all about the worst things that you do and all the mistakes that you make, because his grace is bigger than that. Okay? Okay, thank you.
Can I take a moment also just to say briefly that before you go, find someone to pray with. Mm-hmm. We're not meant to walk in these kinds of sins alone. Mm-hmm. If there's anything that we're addicted to or anything that causes problems in our lives or repeated sin in our lives, the first thing Satan will try to do in order to get you to fall is make you feel like you're alone. And you're not. Whatever you're doing, you're not the first person to do it. Yeah. The stuff you're struggling with, you're not the first person. Yeah. And God has designed and planned a way out. Pray with others and find someone here, and really let that out. Let that out, and through the community that God has given you around you, find release.
Yeah. Will you come talk to me afterwards as well? Thank you. Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
So a lot of my friends, they're non-Christian, and they don't believe in God because of evolution. And having studied biology for 4 years, I understand that there's a lot of evidence behind evolution because of carbon dating and fossil records. But also as a Christian, I see a lot of evidence of creationism and Jesus. So how would you explain to someone who believes in evolution that the Bible is credible?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there's a lot of stuff going on here. Bible, credibility, atheism, evolution, throw it all in a hat and mix it up. It's a fun mix of stuff going on. The first thing I would say is when it comes to evolution, there is a lot of different types of evolution. So when we're talking about evolution, we should be clear which one. For example, when we're talking about microevolution or even speciation, we can demonstrate that. We know it does happen. With like Darwin's finches, for example, that is something that does happen. Even speciation, it's been demonstrated, I think it was out here in California, along a certain valley, the rim of the valley, there was a salamander that was shown to have evolved around that rim of the valley such that when it came back around, they could no longer interbreed, and so you had speciation. These kinds of evolution have been demonstrated, but they do not prove that kind of evolution, which is often used by atheists or agnostics or whoever to make the point that life could have evolved by itself. Life as we know it and all the different kinds out there could have evolved by itself. So far what I've said is there are certain kinds of evolution which we know happen, but that kind of evolution which tries to deny God's sovereign creation over the world, that simply it has not been demonstrated. And there are tons of problems with that kind of evolution. Some of the major issues that people have had to deal with are how over time in the archaeological record, there are things that are explosions of what we would call creation or evolution, whatever word you want to pick in that specific sense. There are these explosions. One's called the Cambrian explosion, when all of a sudden it seems like all these different life forms just popped into existence. How do you explain that with gradual, stepwise evolution, Darwinian evolution? You simply cannot. So that's one major problem of evolution in that sense. Another major problem with evolution, this is starting to get kind of specific, but those who argue for evolution in that more harsh sense here have hit a roadblock. And that is that there is no way to explain the body plans. And we can go into that. What was the name of the book that recently came out which talked about this? I don't recall, but there's a book. So look it up. Body plans. Oh, Carson, you know what I'm talking about. What book was that? Stephen Meyer's most recent book.
Darwin's Doubt.
Darwin's Doubt. That's the one. So go pick that up. It talks about this. So there are problems, very serious killer problems with evolution as presented in that way. That said, I want us all to be good thinkers and not to immediately deny evolution because people around us deny it. Okay, I've seen this happen a lot within Christians. They're like, well, what am I supposed to believe? Okay, I'll say what I'm supposed to believe. But that's just mindless. We ourselves need to think. We need to take a look at the evidence. And if this is a big issue for us, and by the way, there are some Christians out there for whom this is not an issue. They see evolution as something that God could have used to create the world. And they say that that doesn't oppose the Bible. As long as they've thought about it and biblically come up with a defense with that kind of a thing, I respect that. At the same time, we need to understand, is this issue important for us? And if it is, what is the evidence for evolution? I remember looking at the evidence for evolution. I was listening to atheists speak, and they presented some brand new argumentation I'd never heard before. It had to do with retroviral DNA and how there's arguments for common descent, et cetera, through this. And my gut reaction, my response should not be, well, how do I refute this? That's thinking more or less like a zealot, or thinking after having come to a conclusion. You should say, well, let me pursue this information. Let me go down this track. Here's the thing. If you believe in Jesus, if you believe in God, then never fear doubting. Never fear doubting. Because what Jesus tells us is he's the life and the truth and the way. Right? The truth. I said that backwards. Some of you are calling me a heretic. You said that backwards and people, whatever. There's the way, the truth, and the life. If Jesus is the truth, then don't fear truth. That's where your faith should carry you. In saying, okay, if Jesus is the truth, then I'm going to pursue that. I'm going to pursue that. You're providing this argument to me, you're rebutting this. I'm going to pursue that. Because at the end of the day, I am not afraid of the truth because I believe Jesus is found wherever the truth is. So, your last issue, the Bible then. How does all this relate to the Bible? Well, a lot of it has to do with the way people read Genesis. We need to make sure that we are accountable for how we read the Bible. Some people tell us to read the Bible a certain way. Other people tell us to read the Bible another way. There's more than one way to read the Bible, folks, and you got to figure out why you're picking the way that you're picking. This is what happens when we start thinking and owning our own faith. And so we read Genesis. We're responsible before God for our beliefs. And so read it for yourself and understand, is this posing a problem for me? Personally, my personal take on evolution, I don't see enough evidence that's consistent with the theory in order to show that evolution happened. I simply don't. If there were that kind of evolution, that kind of evidence, I wouldn't be afraid of it at all. And I want to embrace whatever the truth is. But I don't see it, regardless. One last issue I think you should think of when talking to friends is the issue of evolution covers one thing, and that's how lower forms of life became higher forms of life. I think the bigger question is, how did we get life in the first place? How did we get that beginning of life? There's all kinds of ideas on how the origin of life may have happened, but none of them explain this world. None of them explain this existence. None of them actually work, is what I'm trying to say. So one person to look into for that, his name is Fuz Rana, and he has written a few books on the origins of life. But how do you get from not life to life? That's the big mind-blowing thing. How did any life exist in the first place? To evolve, if evolution's true. And that's where I would talk with your friends. I would focus on that issue. Thanks.
Hey, hello? Okay, cool. What's up, guys? My name is Melvin. First of all, I just want to say thank you for coming.
Thank you.
It's awesome. You guys are cool. Cameron, you got that
You're
sweet
cool
soul
too.
patch. Lucia, you got that mad style. Nabil, you're tall. We should play ball after. Oh, okay. Sorry. Question time. Yeah, so I've just been thinking a little bit about this. Just like, Jesus died 2,000 years ago. The Christian church has been around, for pretty much that much time. And yeah, so God is all-powerful. He can do anything he wants to. And beginning in Acts, the church was crazy, They'd see thousands of people coming to Christ and just community happening. And my question is, knowing that God's so powerful and the church can be too, and the body is, I guess, why over the past 2,000 years has the Christian body, why hasn't it been more, I guess, victorious in the sense of why isn't it this is the gospel, it's the most powerful thing in the world, why isn't it dominating over nations, rather than being wars and all this stuff? Yeah, thanks.
I'll just briefly comment on that, and then I'll allow my colleagues to comment. And I think it'd be helpful for the rest of the questions, if you do have someone in mind on who you want to answer it, identify that person, and then that will help. I would say one thing about the Christian faith flourishing is that it seems to flourish most when people are in distress, when people are not comfortable. The Christian faith is designed for those, I think, who've grappled with brokenness, grappled with destruction all around them, and are now coming to terms with that. We in the West are super comfortable. We're super self-reliant. And in that sense, we're prideful. When we pray the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread, we kind of fly over that. I can go to Safeway to get my daily bread. I really don't need to pray for it, but sure, God, you told me to, so I will. Whereas the Christian faith, for those who day by day are struggling, that is where I see power in the community. Of course, God's power is always there, but in the community. I remember in 2006, I think it was, 2007, I had a colleague who was studying with me at Biola, and he worked in Lebanon. He lived in Lebanon, and so he went back there, and then all of a sudden there was a war that broke out, and he wrote an email to us saying, pray, and some of us started responding saying, God, we pray that the war would end. His response came to us immediately saying, do not pray that the war will end. That's not what we want. In times of war, people start turning to God. Pray that God would be made known through this war. And I just remember that had an indelible impact on me. So I think that's part of it. Early on in the Christian faith, you had a ton of people who were being persecuted. Things like the Diocletian Edict, where people were being sent to jail, being killed for having scriptures that they wouldn't turn in, etc. And the moment you see Christianity stop having that kind of power is when it the Roman Empire embraces Christianity, all of a sudden 50% of the Roman Empire is Christian, and now you don't see that anymore. It went from being a persecuted church to an unpersecuted church. So on the one hand, that was good for the Christians. On the other hand, all of a sudden you stop seeing that outpouring of the power of the Holy Spirit, at least recorded in some of those early church records. That's my take. If you guys want to briefly add.
Yeah, and I'll just latch on to some of what Nabila said there. I think this is so good. It's amazing the way a crisis seems to strip stuff down to its bare essentials. I remember one of the writers I really like, Walker Percy, he talks about why is it that in the West in particular, as Nabila was saying, in cultures where we're comfortable, we sit around and we're generally quite shy, and it takes a lot when we meet new people to open up to them. But if a crisis happens, if something drastically bad happens, if there's a fire or you're on a plane and you're experiencing problems and you can feel it, all of a sudden you have this greater affinity for those around you. And all the petty social squabbles, all those minor differences tend to drift away, and you're reduced to just people together trying to hold on to each other in this time of crisis. So I think we see a similar theme here. When we're comfortable, when we're in a place where we are misled by the illusion that we can make it on our own resources, that we can take care of ourselves, we forget that we're actually suffering under a delusion of being self-sufficient. And sometimes it takes a crisis in our lives. Sometimes something awful happens to us, an illness, we lose somebody, and we suddenly realize how fragile life truly is, and how we are not in control, and how in the end we ourselves can't save ourselves. We can't control life, and that tends to remind us, if we are open to it and if we are honest, of our dependence and our reliance upon God. And in those moments, the Lord's Prayer takes on a whole new significance and meaning of praying that God will give us what we need, give us our daily bread, and deliver us from evil. And so I think it's true. I think oftentimes comfort, convenience, these are great things, but they are also dangerous. And I think this is why the church tends to flourish in a setting where we're reminded, or where we know, and there's no question about the fact that we're not in control, that we are not self-reliant, and that we can't make it on our own. So I think a very good question. I think it gets at the heart of so much of our unique struggles here in the North American setting as well.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Luke, and I just want to thank you for the conference that you've put here. And I'm involved in a speech and debate league, and we actually have an event called Apologetics, the Defense of the Christian Faith. And I just wanted to ask you a question from one of the categories that we have to present about in our speech and debate competitions. And it is, how is Christian stewardship distinct from the environmentalist movement?
Wow.
How is Christian stewardship distinct from the environmentalist movement? I mean, I'll just to throw a quick answer there. I think the Christian movement is focused around God, whereas the environmentalist movement is focused around the environment.
Yeah, okay. How can I clean this up? No, I'm joking, I'm totally joking. No, actually, I mean, I guess I actually would have to agree with Nabil. I mean, I think it's a difference of the Christian stewardship movement is focused on recognizing that there is beauty in what God has done, and therefore we want to protect it, and I'm grateful for it. I love nature. One of my favorite books of the Bible is Job, and several chapters of it are devoted to just God and talking about his amazing creation, and I love it. So I am a big supporter of that. However, I think with the environmental movement, I think what I wonder is, and this is kind of getting back to what I was maybe referencing in the talk, is what is the purpose of trying to save this environment if the world is just going to be destroyed anyways? So I see almost a sense of efforts and like a care and like almost like a reverence for something, but but there's nothing there that's given it reverence or honor in that sense. So I almost kind of wonder, have they just imposed a certain kind of value to the planet that their worldview doesn't hold? Whereas for me, although I don't think a tree is more important than a person, I am grateful for God's creation. I do think it's beautiful. And the Bible says the heavens declare the glory of God and the earth shows the work of his hands. So I definitely think it's beautiful in that sense. So, yeah.
And that's what I was getting at.
Yeah.
What she said.
When it comes to environmentalists, what you have from that perspective is the world that's around you is incidental. It's what's there. So let's take care of it. Whereas from the Christian perspective, we're given this world. You see in Genesis from the very beginning, the point of the world that man was given, that Adam was given, is to be steward over that. And so now we have imbued with purpose both our creation and the world around us. And so in that sense, I think when Christians take a look at the environment, we should feel a sense of ownership over it, a sense of stewardship that's much deeper than the environmentalist sense of stewardship, which is incidental, not grounded in the creation of that. Also, I believe that kind of in the manifestation of the way environmentalists often work, what you have is that desire to serve something greater than you, something outside you. Same thing with people who go crazy for brand names. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Japan, but some people will just Adidas, everything Adidas, and they'll go running, and then I'm Adidas, or whatever, Nike or whatever. They just grab onto a brand or a sports team. We do that here, right? So certain sports teams, all about, what do we have in LA? Lakers? Lakers,
LA Kings. The Kings,
whatever,
hockey.
stop, yeah. So it's like just 100%, they try to latch on to something greater than themselves. And I think that's a natural human inclination. And in this case, it's manifested towards the environment. I think what it's supposed to point to is towards God. Latch on to something greater than ourselves. Well, the one thing that's eternal. So in that sense, I think we have a skew on the environmentalist. But I think the core of it is, once again, there's purpose here in the Christian perspective. And it comes from true value, not incidental value.
Hi. So my non-Christian dad asked me and my sister a question while we were coming here that kept him from believing in God. And so it was, there are many kind people who do good in their lives and that don't believe in God but still go to hell. But isn't that sort of really unfair? So how do we answer him and sort of encourage him towards God?
Yeah, I would say, if the criteria to get into heaven was you had to be good, and so then someone who did good deeds end up in hell, then yeah, I would say that's unfair. But the reality is it's not my heaven, so I don't get to make the rules. And I say that not at all in a nasty sense, but in the sense of, it amazes me how as humanity, we have this idea in us that I'm a good person, therefore I'll go to heaven. Where does this idea come from that just because I do good things, I'm going to go to heaven? Somehow we form this correlation between I do good and God will accept me. But what would that look like? So it looks like I go before God and I say, all right, God, I've done, let's say, so I've died to go before God and I say, God, I've done 10,000 good deeds, therefore you have to let me in. Okay, so he has to say, okay, I guess you're telling me I have to let you in because you have done it. Or what about the person who's standing behind you in line and has only done 9,999? I guess it stinks to be them. So what is the quantity of good deeds that we need to do to get there is what I want to know when people raise that point. Is if you do good deeds, therefore God will accept you, well, how many do you have to do? Number one. Number two, then we get into this whole morality thing. How do you know what good is? Does one bad deed disqualify a bunch of other ones? Is this situation good over here, or is it good to behave this way over here? So now you're in that kind of situation again. How do you know what's good? But I think the third thing, and for me this is the most important, is it really true that you would want to believe in a God that will only accept you and allow you into heaven because you've earned it? In other words, he only accepts you because of what you've done. So let's think about that in terms of our parents, right? When children are born, the labor process caused their mother a lot of pain, right? And they come out, and what does the mother say? I love you. Just for you are. You haven't done anything but cause me pain. You won't work for the next 18 years of your life. You won't work for the next 18 years of your life. You won't support us. I mean, we're going to have to put our time and our energy, and you're waking me up at night, but you know what? I love you anyway because you're my child. And that's the way God looks at us. You don't have to earn my love. What would we feel like if our parents said, okay, Mom, I did all these things today, your checklist of things. Now do you love me? Now do you love me? How would that make us feel to live a life like that? And this idea of that I'm good, therefore he'll accept me, means that you're essentially saying, I'm okay with serving a God who will only love me if I do certain things. And that's just not the Christian God. And it's definitely not a God I'd want to serve. So that's a great question. I mean, I hear it a lot. And so I just question people on how many good things do we have to do? How do we know what good is? And number 3, most importantly for me, I don't know if that's a God I want. I don't know if that's a heaven I'd want to go to. Because that certainly seems like it's a place of a God who really doesn't genuinely love me. So.
Hello, my name is Noah Pachivchi. I'm just part of the same speech and debate club that Luke is part of.
Okay.
So, likewise, I have a question. Is Christianity a religion of intolerance?
No.
I can go. Okay. I mean, I have to agree with Emil again and say, no, I don't think it is. No, I really genuinely don't, and this is why. For whatever reason, we have formed this idea that if you profess something as true, you're being intolerant to everything else. And just like we were talking about this morning when I was talking about truth, truth by nature is exclusive, okay? So truth, just by in and of itself, is going to exclude other things. So what Christians are doing is they're trying to share with people what they believe is true. And they're not trying to say, they're not trying to come down. I mean, it can come across that way, but they're really not trying to come down on people and make it seem like I won't be around you or anything like that. In fact, it's the opposite. We're told to love our enemies. It's a very opposite viewpoint of anything else. So there isn't this really idea of us being intolerant of other people. In fact, for Christians, we see value in everybody. We see that people are created in the image of God. We know how we are to treat other people regardless of how they believe in. We are supposed to be the light of the world. I mean, even while Jesus was on the cross, he says, Father, forgive them, the very people who are crucifying him. So there's for me, I don't see any place for intolerance at all. But there is a place where we are also trying to share truth with people, and I think oftentimes that's confused with being intolerant.
And if intolerance is defined as a wholesale endorsement of anything, then I would say that's a faulty view of tolerance. If tolerance is defined as the wholesale endorsement of any practice or any viewpoint, I would say that's not even possible. By nature, truth is exclusive, and you're going to commit to one set of beliefs that necessarily will exclude another. But again, as Alicia was saying, the ultimate Christian command is to love God with all that you are, and then to love others as yourself. And I don't see any possible way in which this can be construed as intolerant. You are told to love your enemies. And moreover, as Christians, we believe that you are a child of God, that fundamentally who you are is a person made in the image of God. It doesn't matter what social background you come from. It doesn't matter whether you're disabled, whether you're gifted. None of that is taken into account where your value is concerned. I don't know of any other belief system or worldview that takes such a high view of the human person. So high, in fact, that the God of all creation laid down his life for you, for me. That attaches a value to you that is just incomprehensible. And so to look at that and to see it as intolerant is very, very difficult for me. If you actually look at it, it's so hard to reconcile that with the actual Christian message. That no matter who you are, no matter what you've done, no matter what's happened to you, you are a person created in God's image. And so I think we need to take that into account, really wrestle with that, really think about what that means when we consider the question of intolerance, and particularly the way it's often framed in the media and in popular venues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your time. Can you contrast the Christian view of man's destiny with that of Buddhism?
Ooh. Well, so with my limited Buddhist knowledge, the destiny of Christianity ultimately is to be united and reunited with their Creator, okay? That you're here for a certain amount of time, but ultimately the place of the highest thing that we can, or the greatest thing that we can look forward to is to be united with our Creator. For Buddhism, it's more of reaching this particular place of enlightenment or freeing yourself from desires. And I guess in Christianity, it's almost the opposite in the sense of it's the complete fulfillment of everything you've ever wished for and everything you've ever wanted, because you finally get to meet him face to face. So I guess I would see them as reaching for two different things. One is, you are no longer searching or desiring anything, and that somehow reaches you to this ultimate enlightenment state. Whereas I desire very much so to see the face of Jesus. So.
If I weren't a Christian, I would find Buddhism very compelling. Because Buddhism says essentially that life boiled down to its core is pain. And because life is pain, the problem is you have desires. The problem is you form attachments to things, to people, and that's going to cause you more pain. So what do you have to do? Get rid of your desires. And what do you ultimately have to do? Get rid of yourself, efface yourself, and achieve nirvana. So your identity, ultimately, in Buddhism, needs to be dissolved, and then you are truly free. But Christianity, far from that, does the absolute opposite. It says that your identity is rooted and fixed in who God has made you, and you are fundamentally made by God, for eternal communion with Him, for His joy in you to be made complete. C.S. Lewis calls this the inconsolable secret of our hearts. And so oftentimes we go through our lives searching for this ultimate sense of fulfillment and joy. And when we look in all of these different places, we often look in all the wrong places. We become addicts in the process. We become so distraught and we become so disillusioned and we feel so betrayed that sometimes if we believe there is no God, if we conclude there is no God in our search, I can see how somebody would say, well, get rid of your desires. But as a Christian, I'm here to tell you that your desires are not misleading you. Your hunger for paradise means something. And we can learn something profound from it. This is why C.S. Lewis says, if I find in myself a desire for an experience which nothing in this world can satisfy, the most likely explanation is that I was made for another world. And what you want is to be recognized and loved for who you are. It's so interesting. You look into the lives of some of the people who are famous, who have achieved so much success, who have really seen their wildest dreams realized, and then they feel so broken and hurt when it doesn't do for them what they thought it would. I think of Kurt Cobain, a guy who I looked up to for so many years when I was in high school. And he said in his letter of suicide, he said, I used to love going up on stage. I would relish the roar of the crowd. I just fed off that energy and I loved it, but it's not enough anymore. It's not doing it for me, and I can't even begin to describe to you how guilty I feel about it. It's not enough. Because in the end, we're satisfied by nothing less than the King of all creation looking upon us and saying, well done, good and faithful servant. And so, as Alicia said, those desires reach their culmination and fulfillment in Christianity. But if not, then they feel like a total and cruel betrayal.
Hi, so I'm Tim, and this is more of a personal question, but as someone who's grown up in the church, I've seen the capacity of Christians for hypocrisy and backstabbing and all those kinds of things. And so it can be difficult to trust your brothers and sisters in Christ. And essentially my question boils down to, is there room for cynicism in Christianity?
Is there room for cynicism?
Don't give a cynical response, Nabil.
I'm trying, man. I'm trying. I am interested to hear your opinion on this. We're two ends of the spectrum. I don't know if you've noticed this yet, but Cameron's like, I would be a Buddhist if I weren't a Christian because life boiled down to its core is pain. And I'm like, dude, life boiled down to its core is awesome. It's just like, we're just like two opposite ends here. So I'd be interested to see what your perspective is on this. One thing I would want to say, though, is that the thing about the church, the thing about the body of Christ, what's fascinating to me about it is that God has chosen this instrument in order to minister to the world. I don't know if you've noticed this yet or not, but he tends to work through people. He's placed you, he's given you certain gifts and skills, he's given me certain gifts and skills, and he works through people to reach others who are hurting. So somehow he uses us to do that, but at the same time, in order to get into this club, in order to get into the church, you have to admit you're a sinner. So if there's any place we can expect to find brokenness, it would be in a group of people who admit that they are broken. So when we come to a church, I would, especially a lot of people see the church as, their church. I would expect to see some people in that church who are not yet really Christian, for one. Some who, are still wrestling with their brokenness, their hypocrisy, their cynicism. They're still wrestling with that. A lot of people have left the Christian faith based on not Christianity, but things Christians have done. Mm-hmm. And I would encourage anyone who's in that position, said, my pastor hurt me, or my church hurt me, and those hurts are real hurts, and those pains are real wounds. I would encourage that person to think for a moment that they are broken people, whereas Christ has not hurt anyone. Was it Gandhi who said, I love Christianity, I hate
I love their Jesus. Right. Christians.
Yeah, I like your Christ, I don't like your Christians. It's like, I like the idea of Christ. I like who Christ is. I like that person. But Christians have somehow mucked it up. Mm-hmm. And the fact of the matter is, yes, we are broken people. This church is broken. A lot of people also take the name Christian for themselves. I think in the most recent survey, somewhere between 80 to 85% of the United States call themselves Christian, wherein I would never call those people Christian. For me, the criterion of being Christian is, do you follow Jesus? That's not the sole criterion, but that is the main criterion. Do you follow Jesus? If someone calls themselves a Christian and doesn't follow Jesus, doesn't even try, doesn't even care, now what that person does is going to be imputed to the church. People are going to see that as hypocrisy. So when you say, is there room for cynicism? I'm feeling where you're coming from. I'm feeling the hurt, the betrayal, the suffering, and all that. I'm feeling it sounds like they're personal relationships that have caused some real deep pains there, and I understand that. It's happened to me. It's happened to me, and I can't go into those stories because there's still people involved. But that kind of thing has happened to me. What I hope that cynicism can translate into is a personal drive to reflect Christ more. A personal drive to reflect Christ more. Because if we see the brokenness in somebody else, there's only so much we can do for that person. And quite often, if there was emotions involved, relationship involved, it's probably a good idea not to do anything there, but to instead embody grace. Instead, to make sure that we do not do that to others, or to the best of our ability, we don't lord things over other people. Oftentimes, pridefulness, or oftentimes an image of perfection is what causes others to fall. We got to make sure we don't do that. Part of our struggles as ministers, when we're handed microphones and put on a stage, is that we have to let people know that though we're speaking what we believe to be is true, we're not perfect people. We have to convey that too, because if we try to pretend like we're perfect before others, we can hurt people when we fall. I know there was this one church in Colorado where two major tragedies happened at the same time, both related. The first one was that the pastor was caught having multiple adulteries. This is one of the largest churches in Colorado. And so many people immediately became cynical, and many of them left the church. Well, some stayed, and out of those that stayed, a few weeks later, a 12-year-old in the congregation came with a gun and started randomly shooting people. And the reason why he was randomly shooting people is this exact thing. He felt like he had been betrayed by the church. So that one church underwent two major tragedies, one after another. So the cynicism, how do we process that? How do we translate that? We should let it drive us towards Christ. Get us on our knees to say, God, this pain I know is not right. I don't want to be the cause of this pain to others. Help me forgive. Help me show grace, because if you are willing to forgive me, remember that parable where there was a man who owed a huge debt and he was forgiven. And yet he demanded that someone who owed him a small debt be thrown into jail. If we have been sinned against by someone and we feel angry at them and let that cynicism burn within us, then we are that slave, holding this other slave accountable when we've received so much forgiveness from God. I think there's a verse in Matthew chapter 7, it's either 16 or 21, somewhere around there, which says that unless you forgive, you will not be forgiven. And the idea here essentially is that if you receive true forgiveness from God, you will pour that forward to others. You'll see your own brokenness before His holiness, and then you'll look at other people's brokenness and say, I see myself in you. I see myself in you. So is there room for cynicism? My answer would be, brother, if it drives you to Christ, and only in that way. Otherwise, it will start eating at your heart, and it will be a poison to you. It'll be a poison to you. Forgiveness is expunging that, and grace is expunging that, and embodying Christ is then ministering to those around you through your pains.
Yeah, I honestly don't have much to add to that, Nabil. That was fantastic. Yeah, just to say that cynicism, if it's unaddressed, I understand we need to be circumspect and realistic about the fact that we are dealing with human beings. And because of that, and believe me, I've felt the sting of this one too. I've had people who I've trusted I've experienced betrayals, and I've seen, and it's also when it comes from the hands of somebody who is a brother in Christ or a sister in Christ, somebody you trust and you love, it carries with it the real temptation to make us jaded. But cynicism, if it really takes root in your heart, can become a profound form of soul sickness. Just look at our culture. I think we're one of the most cynical cultures out there, because cynicism thinks it sees through everything and understands everything about human motives, sees through everybody and reduces everybody, and it closes you off from learning, from connecting with others, and oftentimes it can really end up isolating you, and it can calcify in your heart. And so if it acts as an initial goad to pursuing a higher degree of Christ-likeness, I think that's the only possible way, I think, that you could countenance cynicism. But it's something we have to be very careful with, because it doesn't take a whole lot before it completely infiltrates your thinking. It tends to take over the way you look at people, the world, human beings, and it can profoundly warp your understanding, because in spite of all of our brokenness and our mistakes, there are wonderful people out there. There are wonderful outpourings of the gospel. We were just reminded at one of our meetings recently that all around the world, the gospel is bearing fruit. Just look at China. There is so much to be encouraged about. The gospel has not lost any of its power. We carry this treasure in earthen vessels, yes, but it is a treasure. And the Lord, by His great grace, has allowed us, fallen as we are, to be messengers of light. And I think we need to concentrate all of our hope, all of our comfort into that marvelous fact. And I think that needs to really guide our perspective and our thoughts and the way we look at others and the world.
For the sake of time and with great sadness, this will have to be our last question. So.
Oh. Feel bad. I have another question for you.
Me?
Yeah. On Islam and Christianity. For us Christians, we know that we're going to go to heaven when we repent and accept the fact that we are sinners, and we sincerely follow Jesus, like with all of our hearts. Now, with a Muslim, when they sincerely follow Allah, do they know if they're going to be forgiven, or they still don't know, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it does. Thanks. Thanks for your question. As we minister to people, it is important to enter into their mindsets, enter into the way they see the world, because we tend to often answer questions or say words expecting other people to think the same meaning, the same definition applies to certain words. Usually when people, especially like Muslims, for example, use the word sin, that doesn't mean the same thing that it means for Christians. So I'm glad you're doing exactly this, stepping into their mindset. When it comes to the Muslim notion of, well, for one, following, most generally people don't follow Allah. When it comes to Islam, people follow Islam. Slight distinction, and Muslims would say, of course we follow Allah. But pay attention to the rhetoric, pay attention to the terminology. From what I've seen, usually it's honoring Islam, and there's a difference there. The zeal that I've seen amongst Christians has been for God. The zeal that I've seen amongst Muslims has been for Islam. I haven't seen too many Christians zealous about Christianity. Mm-hmm. It's about Jesus. There's a distinction there. I think it's an important one to grasp while entering into the mindset. But what your question is accurate. Generally speaking, traditional Orthodox Islam, Muslims could not have been assured of their salvation. There were a few circumstances in which you could. For example, if you had participated in certain battles with Muhammad, then you would have been allowed in, for example, the Battle of Badr. That was one. Another is if you die in jihad, then you would be assured of salvation. That was another. There are some other circumstances in folk Islam as well. Some Muslims believe that if you're on the Hajj, and you die in the middle of Hajj, then you'd go to heaven. So there's those. But traditionally, in the broad strokes, according to Islamic theology, no, you couldn't know if you were saved or not. One of the hadith by Muhammad's successor, Abu Bakr, according to him, he said, even if I had 1 foot in heaven, I would still fear the deception of Allah. In other words, if I have 1 foot in heaven, Allah could still rip me out and put me back in hell. That's a hadith, it's a tradition. And so generally speaking, that's been the view. Now, I do also want to point out that nowadays Muslims kind of believe whatever they want. Especially in the US, they kind of take and mix and match whatever. And so I know a ton of Muslims who would now say, I'm assured of my salvation. But 20 years ago, you wouldn't have heard that. So it is important to ask the Muslims that are around you and that you're connecting with, what do they believe? That's an important one. But traditionally, that assurance of salvation only comes in very certain select circumstances, and they never really have it. I think that is a very interesting point, though. I have a friend whose parents, he comes from a Shia background. He's Muslim now, Christian now, and his parents would say to him that Ali had said, those who do good deeds out of fear of hell, wanting to get into heaven, they are like slaves, whereas those who do good deeds out of love for God are like true followers. And now that he's a Christian, he says to his parents, don't you realize that's the Christian message, is that God has given us heaven. When we do good deeds, it's not because we're trying to earn his favor. Like someone said earlier, does God get disappointed at us when we fail? No, God's love for us is infinite. It's his love for us that brings us into heaven, so we don't have to worry about that. When we do things for God, it's out of an expression of love. Like if I want to give my parents a gift, that's because I love them. If they tell me to do something and I only do it because I'm afraid they'll punish me, that's not love. But if they tell me to do something and I do it because I want them to be happy and I love them, that's why the Christian does the good deeds that they do. Same thing for self-sacrifice for others. It's not to earn something for myself. It's not indirectly selfish. It's truly altruistic. I love you because you are worthy of love. So there's a very big difference there. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks.
Let's give the speaker panel another hand. Thank you guys so much.